See my screen? Are you able to see my
Yes,
screen?
yes.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this so interesting workshop. And actually, my talk is devoted to suggest a particular account about the relationship between mind reading and self-consciousness, which is called mind reading priority account. The basic idea I'd like to argue today, in a sense, unconventional regarding the common sense view and maybe also the mainstream trend in philosophy. Indeed, according to the common sense view, self-consciousness is the climax of human cognition. This circumstance prevents the ordinary feeling of being special in the animal kingdom, in the world, thanks to the faculty of self-consciousness. But to be honest, one can doubt how much nature cares about her satisfying feeling of being self-conscious or our feelings at all. Nature works according to the its rules, and these rules do not care about our feelings. What if self-consciousness has any top role in human cognition? In particular, here, is self-consciousness really prior to mind reading, or the contrary? Call the first thesis self-consciousness priority account, and the other mind-reading priority account. While mind-reading priority account is also the view that mind-reading evolved prior to self-consciousness, self-consciousness priority account is the claim that self-consciousness evolved prior to mind-reading. In this talk, I will argue for the moderate mind-reading priority account. That is the idea that non-conceptual mind reading is prior to self-consciousness, but conceptual mind reading depends on conceptual self-consciousness. This is the outline of my talk. The starting point is the question whether mind reading is prior to self-consciousness, and because I would like to argue for mind reading priority account, of course, we have to realize that all depends on what you mean by the expression mind reading and self-consciousness and priority too. I will present a dual process account based on the idea that there are two different modes of brain processing, that is system 1 and system 2. Then I will apply the dual process account to mind reading priority account. And as a result, we have system 2 and system 1 about mind reading, and the same about self-consciousness. So we have to reformulate mind reading priority account accordingly, and then I'll take into consideration what the word prior or priority mean. And we have to distinguish between many types of priorities, that is conceptual, functional, developmental, neuroscientific, and evolutionary. And at this point, we can ask if mind reading priority account, so reformulated, is empirically true or false. And as a result, we will have a reformulation of mind reading priority account, which consists in a moderate mind reading priority account. I have two theoretical preferences. And these preferences are simply intentionalism and the use of the dual process accounts about the brain working. Intentionalism is the thesis that by and large the mind is made up by representation, and that intentionality is the key feature of mental representations. The story usually goes as follows. Cognitive processes are information processing, the behavior of which are precisely mental representations. Intentionality is a subpersonal property, while on the contrary, intention, or the intentional stance in Daniel Dennett terms, are personal properties. Intentionality as a subpersonal property is the feature that representations should have, being referred to an internal content, which is presented according to a given representational mode or format. This perspective has its modern roots in John Locke's theory of ideas, but I think that it has achieved its standard formulation during the classical German age, thanks to philosophers such as Kant, Reinhold, and other theorists of the universal Kantian universal grammar. And at the end of that century, there was the second famous formulation, which is due to Franz Brentano. In between, there is all the phenomenon of psychologization of the theory of mental representation, from philosophy to empirical psychology. The other, my theoretical preference, is toward the dual access account about about how the brain works, and mm, this account is based on the idea that there are two different modes of brain processing. There are many different ways to label these two modes of brain processing. Too much, maybe. And for this, I prefer to use the most neutral terms available in the literature, that is System 1 and System 2. In this table of labels attached to dual processes in the literature, you can see both the authors and the way and the word and the expressions they use to call System 1 and System 2. And in the table 2, you can see the clusters of attributes which are associated with dual systems of thinking. According to which System 1 is characterized by unconscious, implicit, automatic way of thinking, while System 2 has the feature of being conscious, explicit, controlled. The System 1 requires a low effort. On the contrary, System 2 requires a high effort. The first one is rapid, and the second one is slow, and so on. Well, I would like to use a couple of passages by Peter Carruthers to going further in my argument. One can envisage two broad accounts of the evolution of a capacity for self-knowledge. One is first-person based. It is that self-knowledge evolved for purposes of metacognitive monitoring and control. On this account, organisms evolve a capacity for self-knowledge in order better to manage and control their own mental lives. By being aware of some of their mental states and processes, organisms can become more efficient and reliable cognizer and can make better and more adaptive decisions as a result. The contrasting account of the evolution of self-knowledge is third-person based. It maintains that the adaptation underlying the capacity for knowledge of one's own mental states is a mind-reading faculty consisting of a body of core knowledge about the mind, or a domain-specific learning mechanism with representational primitives, or both, which evolved initially for social purposes. According to Carruthers, while interesting, bodily self-knowledge has little to do with awareness of oneself as a cognitive being. It is well known bodily self-knowledge was measured by a celebrated experiment by Gordon Gallup in Animal Kingdom and Amsterdam in developmental psychology. And to return to Peter Carruthers' text, rather the mirror test measures an ability to notice cross-modal contingencies, becoming aware of the mapping between one's bodily movements and what one perceives in the mirror. It is a very basic interpretation of what the mirror test means. Knowledge of one's own current mental states, however, is arguably more fundamental than either knowledge of one's traits or knowledge of oneself as a self with an ongoing mental life. On the contrary, according to me, bodily self-knowledge is a key component of self-consciousness. It is indeed the system one of self-consciousness and, so to speak, an alpha of the self-consciousness experience itself. My position is in the middle between the enthusiastic attitude of Gordon Gallup, according to which the ability to self-recognize in the mirror by the apes simply means that they are self-conscious, and the skepticism about this by Peter Carruthers in the philosophical field, and the correspondent skepticism in psychological fields, for example, by Cecilia Hayes. Applied both in the field of mind reading and self-consciousness, this way of reasoning means that we should have a system one mind reading, a system two mind reading, a system one self-consciousness, and a system two self-consciousness. We have four things. System one mind reading refers to a plethora of mental phenomena, including sensory motor empathy, emotional contagion, and so on. By and large, all these mental phenomena are ruled by the mirror neuron system. System 2 mind reading refers to another set of capacities which are currently understood in terms of the capacity to figure out what other people think. It is a matter of prediction of other people's behavior by means of an intentional vocabulary. On the other side, system 1 self-consciousness refers to the ability of human beings and other animals ability to recognize their own schema or body image. The typical situation is the ability to self-recognize, self-recognition in a mirror, but you can also consider the ability to recognize how our skin is smooth, the smell of our body, and so on. And finally, system 2 self-consciousness refers to the so popular stream of consciousness. It is a matter by and large of inner speech and the capacity to have the most sophisticated ways inner life happens in human beings, made up by concepts like responsibility, towards the meaning of the concept we entertain, and so on. This means, in the end, that we have two levels of mind reading: a low-level simulation concerning the understanding of the aim of an action, understanding that is controlled by the mirror system, the brain, and a high-level simulation, which is an activity of projection consisting in cognitive processes, such as taking the different point of view from one's own counterfactual imagination at all the mental phenomena stressed by, for example, Alvin Goldman in his simulation theory. On the other side, we have two components of self-consciousness. We above mentioned it, that is self-recognition and reflexive reasoning. This way, mind reading priority account could mean different things according to the appeal to the system 1 or system 2 mental processing. In particular, mind reading priority account could mean that system one mind reading is prior to system one self-consciousness, that system one mind reading is prior to system two self-consciousness, that system two mind reading is prior to system one self-consciousness, that system two mind reading is prior to system two self-consciousness, and finally that mind reading as a whole, that is system one and system two mind reading, is prior to system one and system two self-consciousness as a whole. Well, it is time to take into account what the phrase is prior to, or the word priority actually mean. Priority, indeed, could be conceptual, functional, developmental, neuroscientific, or evolutionary. Here, a quotation by a paper by James Doe. Mind reading priority could be a conceptual priority, that is, mind reading can be conceived independently of self-consciousness. A functional priority, mind reading can be posited as a cognitive mechanism independently of self-consciousness. A developmental priority, which means that mind reading develops in infancy prior to self-consciousness, or a neuroscientific priority. That is, mind reading is a brain function that it is distinct from an active temporally prior to self-consciousness, or finally, an evolutionary priority. That is, mind reading evolved prior to self-consciousness, and self-consciousness is to be understood as a bioproduct of mind reading. End of quotation, by more or less, of course. I take into consideration only the empirical priorities, then developmental, neuroscientific, and evolutionary priorities. And we can now ask for the question if the statement which constitutes mind reading priority account reformulated are true or false. And it seems that system one mind reading is prior to system one self-consciousness, is empirically true. Seems that system one mind reading is prior to system two self-consciousness is empirically true, but it seems that the statement System 2 mind reading is prior to System 1 self-consciousness is false. System 2 mind reading is prior to System 2 self-consciousness seems to be true, and the composition of System 1 mind reading and System 2 mind reading as a whole is prior to the System 1 self-consciousness, and System 2 self-consciousness is hence false. Just to mention some piece of evidence for these conclusions. System 1 mind reading is prior to System 1 self-consciousness, for example, is true because there are a lot of capacities which are typically of System 1 mind reading that develop prior a child become able to recognize his or her bodily features. And these capacities include the ability for imitation, face recognition, gaze following, pointing, and joint engagement. And all these capacities, again, developed prior of the child capacity to recognize bodily features. These are, of course, only developmental evidence, but it seems that they are enough. If the first statement is true, the second statement, System 1 mind reading is prior to System 2 self-consciousness, is true a fortiori. Moreover, consider now the evidence regarding the statement that System 2 mind reading is prior to System 1 self-consciousness. This statement seems to be false, has the case of ape self-recognition in a mirror seems to suggest, just because the ape self-recognition in a mirror happens in absence of an high-level mentalization. And regarding the statement according to which System 2 mind reading is prior to System 2 self-consciousness, we have to say that this is true because there aren't cases of reflexive reasoning without the use of high-level mind-reading abilities, like counterfactual imagination and pretense. Of course, all this means that hence System 1 and System 2 mind reading is prior to System 1 self-consciousness and System 2 self-consciousness as a whole is false. This way, we are now ready to a reformulation of mind reading priority account, getting a kind of moderate mind reading priority account. And the phrase moderate mind reading priority account means that while System 1 mind reading is prior both to System 1 and System 2 self-consciousness, prior both to non-conceptual and conceptual self-consciousness, System 2 mind reading is prior to System 2 self-consciousness, but not to System 1 self-consciousness. In other words, non-conceptual mind reading is prior to self-consciousness, but conceptual mind reading is not prior to non-conceptual self-consciousness. What does it mean for mind reading priority account? Well, all this simply means that not all the mind reading phenomenon is prior to self-consciousness. And for this reason, the reformulation of mind reading priority account force us towards a moderate mind reading priority account. And this way of thinking is based on the idea that non-conceptual self-consciousness evolved in an independent way, and non-conceptual mind reading is prior to self-consciousness, but conceptual mind reading depends on conceptual self-consciousness. Why so? Why things happens this way? My reply is simply that we need an inner space for mind reading working offline. And the logical inner space for mind reading working offline is actually conceptual self-consciousness. Just to quote another time Peter Carruthers, in effect, self-knowledge results from turning our evolved mind-reading capacities on ourselves. Okay, but for what? We need a reason to suppose that turning mind-reading on ourselves was something worth for adaptation. We need a reason from an evolutionary point of view, because we have to consider that self-consciousness is not for free. Is not for free from a biological point of view. It needs, in fact, energy and time. Consciousness, self-consciousness requires sugar in the blood and time for processing. The reason why all this was worth for adaptation is that is a need of a logical inner space which allow us to better perform in social cognition and allows, in particular, mind reading to work offline and make offline simulations. This way of reasoning is based in a word on the idea that the reason why nature paid the cost for self-consciousness, although self-consciousness is not cheap in terms of energy and time, is that this constitutes a condition making social cognition possible in the way human beings usually experience. In other terms, if you want the sophisticated ways social cognition is experienced in our life, you should have something similar to self-consciousness. But of course, I realize that this idea is very unconventional, because it is against the common sense view that self-consciousness and not social cognition is the climax of human cognition and and what make us uniquely humans. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Now, Andrea.
Yes.
Time for your comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Carola. And really thanks, Pietro, for this great talk. So interesting and full of a lot of ideas. Well, I'd like to start by recalling very briefly the main theories on mind reading, because I think there's a strong idea about this topic inside Pietro's talk. And then I'd like to underline the main thesis in Pietro's account to encourage final discussion in some way. So we have the special ability to read other people's minds. If you see someone cry, you can infer that the person is sad. And so, in other words, we are able to go back from the behavior of a subject to the propositional attitudes or the intentional states.
That's a perfectly good property.
Sorry? Okay. I was that we are able, in other words, to go back from the behavior of a subject to the propositional attitudes or to the intentional states that caused that behavior. So we can correctly infer other people's goals, intentions, and desires. How can we actually done it? This is the topic of mind reading, this epistemic chapter of philosophy of mind. There are two main theories about this topic. The first is called theory, as you know, really a funny name that refers to a theory about theories. This theory probably goes back to Jerry Fodor. And according to this idea, when we read other people's minds, we do so by developing theories of how the other mind is functioning. When we see a sort of behavior, we create a theory, thanks to generalization and common sense laws, about the mind behind that behavior. According to theory, kids are little scientists interacting with the world, socializing, and developing theories on how it works. So for supporters of this theory, there is a theoretical aspect at the ground of mind reading. In a certain way, the mind is governed by the use of a systematic set of knowledge. The rival theory is called simulation theory. According to this second idea, we understand other people's minds by putting ourselves in other person's shoes, so to speak, and imagining what we would do or feel if the same thing happens to us. This theory derives even from Kant, and then from the studies of Quine around empathy. The concept of empathy is central. Empathy is the ability to feel what someone else is feeling, to take in the perspective of the other person. And simulation theory is supported by a biological evidence after the discovery of mirror neurons. These neurons fires when you perform an action, but also if you observe the same action in someone else. So this is an indication that simulation theory might be on the right track. But there is a criticism for this theory. The fact that persons grow up in characters and their mental life is different for this motivation. There are situations also like games and competition in which it is necessary to refer to other skills to understand the other intentions. From this point of view, the simulation could be misleading. But the question is there something universal in our mental life? If someone is crying, probably is sad in every culture. The same, if someone is eating, probably is angry everywhere. For Goldman and Gordon, for example, it seems to be a biological foundation for a lot of stuffs we experience in life. And if that's true, simulation theory seems in some way to work. And so this is the point I'd like to underline. Probably these two theories complement each other in Pietro's view. I refer to this debate in philosophy of mind because I'm sure that a moderate mind reading priority account is connected with this form of hybrid view about mind reading, a form that with a theory that we could call, if Pietro agrees, hybrid simulation theory. But this idea that mind reading is a hybrid activity composed of high and low level simulation, as Pietro said, as well as of the reference to theoretical structures, seems in some way to presuppose an asymmetry between mind reading and self-consciousness. And that's the main topic, in my opinion, in Pietro's talk. What's the relationship between self-consciousness and mind reading? Moderate mind reading priority account is an answer to this problem. what are the consequences of this linked to this answer? First of all, there are two levels of self-consciousness, as Pietro said, contrary to the ordinary notion of self-consciousness. The first is the level of self-recognition, the simplest form of self-consciousness, and also the oldest from an evolutionary point of view, I think. It requires a subject being able to refer to himself by means of a representation of all those experiments, like mirror tests in primates, are the demonstration that self-recognition is a primitive form of self-consciousness. The second is the level of reflexive reasoning. If we consider reasoning like Sellers, Brandom, and inferentialism in general in terms of inferences between concepts, to understand what it means to have a certain mental content, we need to give a key role to the notion of inference instead of the classical notion of representation. And if I become the object of my reasoning, it will be the language system with its rules and limitations that provides in some way a framework for reflexive thought and contributes to extend the knowledge I have of myself. And it's interesting that the form of our self-consciousness thought, self-conscious thoughts, according to this account, is the form of a meta-representation that refers to a given reflexive representation. And the sequence of such representations takes place within a story, is, in other words, a sort of narrative form. This is an interesting point, in my opinion, to discuss. Likewise, Pietro and, for example, Alvin Gottman argue for the difference between two levels also in mind reading, as we saw before. For the low level of mind reading, we don't need any intentional attribution. No language role is necessary yet. While the high level implies the whole theoretical framework of propositional intentionality. This means, and this is another really interesting point, among other things, that it is impossible to attribute a mental state without attributing also a propositional content. And so, to summarize Pietro's account and going towards my question, there are a lot of evidence that capacities like imitation, face recognition, pointing, and so on develop prior a child become able to recognize the bodily features. This means, as we saw, that first level mind reading is prior to self-consciousness, but if non-conceptual mind reading is prior to self-consciousness, conceptual mind reading is not prior to non-conceptual self-consciousness. That's the sense of a moderate account of mind reading priority, the sense of the word moderate in the account, in Pietro's account. Self-consciousness is the inner space from which high-level simulation proceeds in its behavioral predictions, and so in understanding the reasons behind the actions of others, as well as our own actions. So, in moderate mind-reading priority account, self-consciousness is not the ground of human being, but a useful product of the evolution that gave us benefits, first of all, in terms of social cognition. And now, my questions. To start, so the Q&A session. The first question, there are general questions, but I think useful to start the discussion. We said that it is impossible to attribute a mental state without attributing also a propositional content. I'd like to go in some way deeper inside the relationship between language and self-consciousness, or the problem of the origin of language and the problem of the origin of self-consciousness. Along this road, is it possible to say that language is, however, the first way to grasp in some way the stream of consciousness? And the second question is connected to the first. Because of language has the role to translate in some way in a social dimension our mental life, that's the demonstration that our social life is based on the consideration of ourselves as mental entities. Therefore, is it possible to say, in your opinion, that social cognition is the engine of evolution process, like in some way pragmatism and Chauncey Wright thought when, at the end of 19th century, Darwinism was developing? Stop myself. It's a big question for us. What about the mark of the mental? I mean, you said that contrary to the ordinary way to see self-consciousness is not the climax of human being. But at the present state of the consciousness evolution, if self-consciousness is the inner space in which high-level simulation is based, can we say that is also the mark of the mental? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrea. Now there's time for a reply by Pietro, and then we start with the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Thank you so much. I completely agree with your summing up of my ideas here presented today, and in your words, this way of reasoning sounds good. So thank you so much for this. You're right. Mentioning the fact that I use it in a hybrid approach that stays in the middle between theory and theory of simulation. I think that it is an old debate in typical of the 19th. We spend a lot of years in deciding if theory of mind or simulation theory are the best way of representing the scenario. But after 20 years, all this debate seems to be too old, and it seems that actually we can speak about theory of mind. Why not referring to the full capacity to represent the ability of human beings to have some kind of idea of what mind is before and independently of being a psychologist, an educated psychology. This way, false psychology and the theory of mind are the counterpart of many folk sciences, like false sociology, folk linguistics, folk physics, and so on. But the way in which this capacity actually works seems to be more similar, that the way of simulation is supposed to go. But I am maybe too much slow, and I would like to take into consideration your final questions. And starting with the last one, I have to say that the adventure of the idea that we can get the mental by using intentionality understood in linguistic terms, using intentionality like an acid test has been a failure, a mistake, unfortunately, of course, because these attempts, the theoretical attempt, required so much work, hard work, but in the end, all the semantics of propositional attitudes was, in this perspective, less helpful as expected. On the one hand, indeed, not all the mind is intentional. Consider, for example, the case of euphoria and anxiety. And on the other hand, not all the intentional, with the S, context refer to the mental. Consider, in this case, the case of modal context. So the semantics of propositional attitude was a very sophisticated field of investigation, but I think that it is not helpful for the Markov mental question. It was a failure, a mistake. I mean, regarding the finally, regarding the relationship between language, self-consciousness, it depends on which self-consciousness we are talking about. We don't need any language for bodily self-consciousness, self-recognition. But if we consider conceptual self-consciousness, we have to say that it essentially consists in a way the language works. That is especially when the language is used by means of a massive use of indexical expressions. well, to be honest, we have to say that maybe it's not only matter of language here in the case of conceptual self-consciousness. Because conceptual self-consciousness should work also by means of other conceptual modalities besides language. And I mean by visual concepts and musical concepts. But to my knowledge, this field of investigation is just at the beginning. I don't know many studies which are devoted to investigate the visual and musical concept reasoning, how it is possible to reason without language and by using visual and musical concepts. And finally, just to go to the end of this reply, yes, I appreciate so much your mention of the engine of the mind. Yes, I think that we can say that self-consciousness is actually the engine for social cognition, the way in which social cognition actually works. And I realized that this is unconventional, both in comparison with the common sense view and in the philosophical perspective. This is because maybe all this has a good justification. Fact is that the point is that if we observe how the animal kingdom and the rest of the world work, we can appreciate that social cognition is so widespread into the animal kingdom. On the contrary, self-consciousness seems to be almost a quasi uniquely human feature. And all these, of course, drive us to consider that self-consciousness is the climax of the human cognition. But against common sense view and against the philosophical tradition, we have the empirical evidence, scientific evidence that cognitive science provides us in the last decades.